Hi there. I'm William Richardson. I'm one of the interns. Welcome to the third podcast in our series on the care of post-operative patients.
And I'm Ed Kim, Dr. Ed Kim, colorectal surgery here at UCSF. In this podcast, we're going to introduce you to an important way we monitor the healing process of a patient after an operation. So, Will, what are some of the specific signs that tell us whether a patient is doing well?
Well, one obvious way to approach this question is to see how the patient compares to our expected trajectory. Are they meeting our milestones? Sort of what we think about.
Okay, you're right, and I think that approach can work, and it's not a bad way, but I think you have to be careful if you do use that approach that you want to avoid rote memorization, you know? So like most concepts in medicine, if you really want to learn it, understand it, and retain it, you got to get down into the mechanism, or also known as pathophysiology in medicine, behind what's going on, and then translating into a story that's easily understandable for you.
Yeah, then I would say our narrative on postoperative patients is that these are individuals who were sort of traumatized by our attendings and chief residents. They come out of the operating room with disturbances in multiple organ systems, which their own body will eventually heal. Our job is to watch over this healing process, providing supportive care and being vigilant of common occurrences that can derail or hinder the physiology of healing.
That's a great summary. I really like how you described it as a disturbance in the physiologic balance, the disturbance in the balance, right? As you mentioned, the stress of the operation causes an imbalance in all of our organ systems, but these imbalances aren't really that visible, and they can even be harder to measure. So, and it would be great if there was a single lab test or a number that we can follow to monitor that the patient's on the healing path, but that's not really the case, is it?
Yeah. It would be great if we had a single number to follow, but right now we process multiple streams of data, including vital signs, labs, etc., to peer into the patient's physiologic status. Often these numbers give a few conflicting signs, though. It's about knowing which number to put more weight on.
Okay, great. Well, what do you think about the eyeball test?
You mean how the patient generally looks?
Yeah.
As an intern, I don't know that we're allowed to use the eyeball test.
Right. I can't disagree with not letting you guys use the eyeball test, but I do believe eyeball test is great when used properly, and it is dangerous when used, overly relied or inappropriately relied on by inexperienced clinician. But what's great about it is that it taps into the instinctive part of our brains, the ability to like read expressions and stuff like that. That's been tens of thousands of years of evolution. It's literally hardwired. And you can explain that by when you look at a surgical or electric outlet, what do you see?
Yeah,
You see a face with two eyes and a mouth. Okay, that's what it means. So, but the problem with beginners is that this innate ability hasn't been refined enough to discern subtle changes and early signs of distress. And so it does require experience, unfortunately, and repetition to develop pattern recognition.
True. Yeah, I also think your distress detection system may be overloaded when faced with a group of patients who are in general poor health. So, all of them look sick, like on a vascular surgery team. It's like your alarm is on all the time.
Right. So what I would recommend, so that you don't lose this eyeball test ability, is when you go in the room, and how often do you do this, Will? You just take in the whole scene,
True.
and you think about what your initial impressions are, your feelings are, and then you should look for signs that led to your initial impression. Does the patient look uncomfortable? Do they look pale, diaphoretic? Do they have labored breathing?
Yeah, I think it's critical to evaluate the objective data to support or refute your global impression. Trust me, it doesn't go over well to tell your chief resident that the patient looks okay without backing up your statement with vital signs, exams, urine output, and labs. But I do try to look at those subjective measures as well.
Okay, good. I think this brings us to the main point of this podcast, which is that among all the pieces of clinical information, probably the most reliable window into a patient's physiology and healing is, wait for it, the urine output, right? So when you think about urine output, what do you think about it as?
I think it's really an indicator of volume status.
But it is much more. In the post-operative patient, I would actually say it's a reliable indicator of ongoing inflammation, and that's what I like to use to monitor the healing process. Because we have said that operations are traumatic, and I think you can think of an operation as causing like a whole body bruise. It's like it does cause a systemic inflammatory response. But have you ever seen a patient before an operation and then afterwards, and see how like different they look sometimes, especially if it's like a 10-hour operation?
Sure. Yeah, we've all heard of patients looking like the Michelin Man with their hands and feet swollen after an operation.
Yeah, it can be impressive.
Of course, during a long operation, patients receive several liters of fluid, especially in open abdominal cases. And usually their postoperative weights are several kilos higher. Falling weights is usually how we determine volume status, especially on services like cardiothoracic.
Okay, great. So what happens in the postoperative period is that as the body starts to recover, the inflammation subsides, and all this extra fluid in the interstitial space goes back into the vascular system, and they pee it all out. And the most common phenomenon is what we call autodiuresis. Have you ever witnessed the autodiuresis occur?
Sure, yeah. Several days after an operation, we'll see a marked increase in patients' urine output, sometimes over 200 cc's an hour.
What's the most urine output you've seen in a 24-hour period?
Probably 4 or 5 liters.
Really? Wow. Okay. And that makes everybody happy.
Mm-hmm.
That means the bruise is starting to come down and people are getting better, right? What that means is we're saying that we're mobilizing they're mobilizing their third space fluids, and how quickly and when the person mobilizes their fluid is really dependent on their overall health and also whether they take diuretics.
Yeah, I've seen people get Lasix. I have seen people though get Lasix sometimes to help them start this fluid mobilization. That means, it's important to know whether they're taking diuretics at home too.
Okay, so when you're taking care of them, so that you know that you might have to start diuretics.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, another reason for following low urine output or another reason for continuing low urine output. So if they're not giving up the fluid, means that there may be continuing inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
So first couple of days, especially big operation, they may still be having a fair bit of inflammation. So they could still have low urine output. And what do you do when somebody has low urine output, typically in the post-op day 1 or 2?
Usually, when patients have low urine output post-op day 1 or 2, we try giving them fluid boluses.
Right. But what about later in the post-op course?
Yeah, later on, I've seen some people give boluses and then giving Lasix.
Right. It's a bit more variable, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
yeah. We're often given the autonomy to order fluid boluses as interns, but it's usually we're usually supposed to consult our seniors before starting Lasix.
You're right, and I think that is important because fluid management issues are a little more complicated later in the post-op period, because this low urine output can mean other things than just inflammation. So if somebody has ongoing inflammation and sequestration of fluid from the operation, but it could also mean that they're developing ileus. And I guess my main point, and I think our main point here, is that low urine output in the later period can also mean a secondary phase of inflammation, which could be caused by a postoperative infection. So, are you more nervous of your low urine output on post-op day 1 and 2, or on day 5 or 6?
Definitely on day 5 or 6.
Yeah. And I think the most concerning pattern is actually when somebody has the appropriate diuresis on the first couple of days, and then it drops off, or they start have low urine output like post-op day 5 or 6.
Right.
Yeah. And I think the typical scenario that we've seen from time to time is like you come in to round and your night float says, we gave this guy a couple of boluses overnight and they're later in the post-op period, and that's when you got to watch out.
Definitely. As summary, I think surgery causes inflammation, and appropriate healing usually coincides with the decrease in this inflammation. A convenient way of following this is with the urine output and what we call autodiuresis. So remember, it's sort of a window into the physiology of the postoperative patient.
Yes. Thank you for listening.